Hello, welcome to Congregation Beth Shalom, and this is our lunch study break here on Wednesday, February 10th, 2021. And we are joined by a special guest for a conversation that I know a number of you have been looking forward to discussing. And so I just want to thank Karen Stiller, who is joining us here. She is spotlit, and she is going to help lead us through a conversation, which is a very hot topic these days on the California Ethnic Studies model curriculum. And we're going to talk about where are we now and what comes next. So let me just introduce Karen here. So Karen Stiller is Middle East Project Director for the JCRC, that's the Jewish Community Relations Council, which is a public affairs organization which represents synagogues and Jewish organizations on critical issues affecting the Jewish community. She assumed that position in 2013 after serving as the JCRC's Peninsula Director since 2002. She's a native of Buffalo, New York. Sorry about the Bills. She moved to the Bay Area in 2000, where she was a project associate in the Preventative Defense Project at Stanford University Centers for International Security and Cooperation. She started her career in social work nonprofit management and has a MSSA and certificate in nonprofit management from Case Western. So I wanted to give your bona fides here, Karen, and introduce you. Thank you for joining us. This is a conversation that I mentioned to you. A number of congregants have been asking me to engage with them on a little bit about me. So you know I am almost, well, not almost, I'm almost here for 3 years, moved to San Francisco a little under 3 years ago from Brooklyn, New York, with my wife, Alana, to be the senior rabbi here at Congregation Beth Shalom. And I'm learning about California politics. I'm learning about San Francisco politics. I'm learning about San Francisco Judaism. So this is an opportunity for me, as much as everybody here, to learn about your work and about this curriculum, because there are issues here that are different, as you might imagine, from what we found in Brooklyn, and we're all learning on the fly here. So if you could maybe just introduce yourself and just begin by sharing what is a JCRC, what does the JCRC do, and a little bit about how you became involved in this issue, and just background, I think, because a lot of us, this might be new.
Sure. So JCRC, as you mentioned, is kind of the public affairs wing of the organized Jewish community. So we're a deliberative consensus building body with representatives from our local organizations and synagogues, and we take positions on a range of issues, and then from things that are concerned to the Jewish community, and then we represent those issues in action. We really try to amplify our community's voice. We're a small community, and we need all the amplification that we can get. So we've been involved in the ethnic studies saga really at this point for about 2 years now. It's really been, it's been kind of a long haul. And so, maybe I'll just walk everybody a little bit through the process. So through what the process has been and really what this is all about. So at its core, ethnic studies is about marginalized communities telling their own stories. These are stories that have been missing for far too long for our classrooms or across the country, not just California. And despite all the problems we've had with the model curriculum that we'll be talking about today, ethnic studies, we don't think that ethnic studies is something that the Jews should be afraid of. In fact, it can be something very positive for the Jews. So first, I'll talk a little bit about the creation of the draft and some of the concerns with the draft, and then what we did about it. And I'll explain the process because it's really confusing. There's a lot of acronyms.
Yeah.
The Jewish community is bad. Well, the Department of Education is right up there with them in terms of acronyms. So in 2016.
Let me just pause you for 1 second. If everyone could just mute themselves, because I'm getting a little bit of feedback here. Yeah, so and I was going to ask you to take us right to 2016 and how, well, you could take us all the way back if you wanted to the creation of ethnic studies writ large, if you wanted to, but take us to how this began to create it into a model curriculum for the state. Thank you.
Sure, sure. Yeah, ethnic studies was created in San Francisco in the 60s, and came as a result. There was really kind of an uprising of sorts.
And to give voice to those communities and to those peoples who have not had a voice because they haven't been writing the history books.
Exactly, exactly, and that's really what it is at the core is marginalized people telling their own story. So we always should keep that in the back of our mind when we're looking at this issue. So in 2016, California passed AB 2016, which required the creation of a model curriculum for ethnic studies, and that is for public schools, for public high schools. The model curriculum is envisioned as a guidance document for districts. There have been 3 drafts of the curriculum, and I'll detail them a little bit later. So what's made this particular model curriculum have such high stakes is that there's been a push at the same time in the legislature to mandate ethnic studies as a high school graduation requirement in California. Governor Newsom vetoed the bill last year to make it mandatory because he felt the curriculum wasn't ready yet. But there is now a new bill, which is almost identical to the past one in the legislature this session. So this mandate still it's very much possible that it could become a reality. Districts will not be required to use the state developed curriculum, but it really will influence the way that ethnic studies is actually taught in the classroom, especially if the legislation is passed. They'll really try to promote this particular curriculum, which I'll say later is a good thing for us. Some districts around the state, including locally in places like San Mateo, Oakland, even Union City, which was one of the first ones actually to mandate ethnic studies. Some of these folks are ahead of the state. They already have required courses. Usually it's a freshman semester course that's required for graduation. Others, like my kid's school, I'm in Fremont, California, and it's not even a blip on their radar. So, the state mandate and the curriculum will really come into play for these districts that are still in the process of looking at ethnic studies. So getting back to the model curricula are overseen by a body called the Instructional Quality Commission, or IQC. So this is an advisory body on curriculum to the State Board of Education. And also overseeing it is the State Board of Education, which has the final approval. And these are appointees from the governor. In July 2019, California's Board of Education approved guidelines to develop the model curriculum. So you had the law, and then you had the Board of Education put together these guidelines. And they were very strong guidelines, actually. They emphasized accuracy, inclusion. They didn't push any particular political agenda or approach to ethnic studies. The original draft, however, had many discrepancies with these state board guidelines. So in January 2019, the State Board of Education approved a model curriculum advisory committee. So this was a group of basically volunteers to draft the model curriculum, and they hired 2 writers. Our JCRC special project called the Institute for Curriculum Services, which it has different things that it does, one of which is it works with textbook publishers on ensuring accuracy about Jews, Judaism, and Israel in our textbooks. It also has its own curriculum and does some teacher training. So they attended the 3 meetings that the writing committee held. We had some red flags already based on who we knew was in this group of authors. And they were really alarmed. They saw how easily this group basically added BDS into the draft. Somebody just said, hey, can you add BDS? And they said, sure. And there was also discussion in one of these meetings where they explicitly sought to exclude Jews and Armenians from the curriculum. So we were pretty alarmed. In May, and started to keep a really close eye on what was going on. In May 2019, the advisory committee's draft, so this was the original draft of the model curriculum, was presented to the Instructional Quality Commission, the IQC. And they basically rubber stamped it. So that they said, we're not going to make any comments, we're just going to pass it into the public comment period. So with every model curricula, there's periods of public comment. And the CDE is required to listen to that public comment and take it under consideration when they're revising a draft. So the first draft was problematic on multiple levels. The very few references to Jews in Israel in the sample course models were all negative. Some of you may have heard that it had a rap in one of the lessons that used like a classic anti-Semitic trope about Jews controlling the media. And it also had included BDS, as I mentioned before, in a couple different places, and other anti-Israel rhetoric. There was no reference to anti-Semitism at all as a form of hate, and there was no meaningful inclusion of Jewish Americans in any form beyond the negative references I referred to about Jews in Israel and Israelis.
Was that surprising to you?
No, we knew based on the authors of the original draft who was on the advisory committee. There were many folks that really one of their big political issues was BDS.
Yeah, I'm just a little naive. So just
Sure.
my naivete. First, so yeah, I saw this California State Legislature notice, which was quite alarming, from the California Jewish Caucus, that says the draft curriculum effectively erases the American Jewish experience, and that comes from Jewish state legislatures. So that's I think reasonably concerning. I guess what's surprising to me is, how does that happen? I guess, how does an ethnic, so I'm a New Yorker, so I acknowledge this is new to me, but to tell the story of New York City and not include Jews as an ethnic minority in that story would be ridiculous. So I don't understand the process that designates Jews as not an ethnic minority.
Sure. So that's a really good question, and it harks back to two things. One is the fundamentals of what ethnic studies at the collegiate level is. Ethnic studies at the collegiate level has focused on 4 foundational groups: Asian Americans, African Americans, Native Americans, and Latinx. Those are the 4 foundational groups, as they call it. Also added in sometimes are Arab Americans under Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. And that's where you see there's a kind of a branch or a wing of ethnic studies that has a very heavy influence from Arab American studies, and in particular the Palestinian cause is high on that agenda. In some regards, politically there's been sort of a hijacking of some of this, saying that you can't separate the Palestinian cause from ethnic studies. That's kind of one wing of ethnic studies at the collegiate level. The folks they brought on the writing committee, like the advisory committee for writing, were folks in that school of ethnic studies. Not everybody, certainly, but a large, hefty portion of them were in that, and they heavily influenced the way this was drafted. They explicitly say that Jews don't belong in ethnic studies. For the model curriculum, they give a couple of reasons. One is they say, well, the Holocaust is already covered in history. That's true, but there's no mention of anything beyond the Holocaust as a Jewish American experience. So Jewish American story, how anti-Semitism plays into white supremacy, all the discriminatory laws historically against Jews, none of that is in the statewide curriculum.
So as someone who works as a Jewish council relations to try to work within the political system, I guess what we've been trying to figure out as a community is, how does the school board get elected that wants to remove George Washington and Abraham Lincoln and Dianne Feinstein? And how does this body to create this draft curriculum have, it's okay to have people who, in my view, who think the Palestinian part is essential to their identity. That's totally legitimate, but there should be we should be inclusive of voices.
Sure. Yeah, no, first of all, number one, JCRC never advocated for removal of any ethnic group, including Arab Americans or Palestinians. That wasn't our issue. We didn't want the political issues. Ethnic studies is supposed to be talk about the American experience, not about a foreign conflict. So that, and it also shouldn't have denigrating materials or promote a cause like BDS that Yeah. So the
So,
advisory committee, the
but
advisory.
is it the governor? Is it the mayor? Is it the
So,
deep
in
state?
this, so it depends on what you're talking about. So when it comes to the ethnic studies model curriculum, the CDE admitted in a private meeting that it fell flat. It made a mistake. It didn't mind the store in terms of who was appointed on the, it was naive. It didn't understand all the politics. I will say the state did a beautiful job in crafting the guidelines, but the guidelines weren't followed because when you say ethnic studies and you bring in ethnic studies experts from the collegiate level, they have a very different vision of ethnic studies. They want to impose a college level ethnic studies course on high school students. So there's a fundamental disconnect there. When you talk about San Francisco, I'm sure you've already heard the joke that there are two political parties in San Francisco, the moderates and the progressives. It's not Democrats and Republicans in San Francisco. And so San Francisco politics are a whole nother ball of wax. The school renaming, all of this is related. We have, some perspectives on that, particularly Dianne Feinstein.
Yeah, no.
We were very
Sure.
opposed to that. It's kind of offensive putting her in the same league as people who committed genocide against Native Americans. It made no sense, and there's a heavy political element to all of this. The school board is very progressive.
So
that's a bad thing, but
can we enter into maybe a little bit edgier content here? Tell me about critical race theory, because one of the things that came up in this controversial tablet article, which I shared, which really rankled some feathers, is how the ethnic studies curriculum, the ethnic studies departments, all revolve around a idea of critical race theory, which views, I guess I can't say what it is, so maybe you can explain it. Thank you.
Sure. Okay. So first of all, the tablet article was extremely biased, had many factual inaccuracies, and it was very misleading. I mean, I'm not going to mince words on it. It's been a nightmare for us, and it's taken a lot of our resources and energy to try to correct the story.
Tell us the errors.
So so first of all, it was written from a perspective. It was presented as a news story, but it really was perspective. It was this person's perspective opposed to, the political underpinnings of ethnic studies. And that's opinion, it's not fact. Second, there were things like, I'll give you one example. So it talked about how in San Mateo County, they stopped teaching history, world history. They instead are teaching ethnic studies. It's simply false. It's 100% false. They still have an entire year of world history and one semester of ethnic studies. They changed the course around a little bit, but if the person who wrote the article would have digged deeper, they would have realized how they reformatted the course. All the standards are still there. They said the Holocaust was teachers were falsely assuming the Holocaust was taught. Holocaust is still it's mandated by the state. It is still in that curriculum. So that was one piece that was misleading. There was also, they talked about another piece that was, they said it was in the state curriculum. It was a reference to something 50 pages later in a journal. The only thing that was used from that journal was a poem on the first few pages. And you had to dig 50 pages later to find this obscure thing, which is a quote from a letter to the editor in a Syrian newspaper. So the likelihood that teachers would ever come about that and introduce to that classroom is zilch. So that's another example of how it really misled people. And it was really frustrating because there were enough issues with this process that we didn't need to make stuff up. Now, that being said, some people have very strong particular perspectives on critical race theory. And I'll say two things from that perspective. I'm not an expert. I don't pretend to be an expert. So it's for me to explain it, I don't want to wade into territory in which I'm not an expert. But I will say it's not our fish to fry. JCRC is that it's just not the issue that we're focusing on. Second, regardless of where you stand on critical race theory, this is California. It's not Texas. It's not Kentucky. In those states, you might get a strictly multicultural approach that doesn't touch on issues like race, power, privilege. Even a lot of folks talk about the curriculum in LA Unified. Even that curriculum, which has, they have very strong um, sort of guidelines and guardrails in it to make sure that it's not biased. Even there, they touch it on issues of race, power, and privilege if you look at what's actually written there. So 100% separating ethnic studies, which is about people of color telling their own stories, and part of those stories involve race, privilege, and power, and critical race theory, it's not going to happen. Now, that being said, um, you know there are concerns. There were concerns with the language. There was concerns with how politicized, particularly the first draft was in particular. A lot of that content most of it has been changed. In
Yeah,
fact,
where we
ICS,
are
the Institute for
right now
Creative
with the
Services, helped de-radicalize, if you will, some of the language, taking out things like, instead of focusing on capitalism, they were focusing on systems of economic inequality, which could be any economic system, including socialism or communism. And there, there's other examples like that. I mean, the third draft isn't perfect. Nobody's going to say it is, but it doesn't do any of us any good if we use scare tactics or misleading information.
I think that's very important because the climate in this country has been hot, as you might have noticed. And it seems that they're really easy battle lines to get into. And the idea of having minorities and people of all ethnicities share their stories and be found in our textbooks sounds really lovely, and something that we should aspire to. And I think as someone who's new to the state or relatively new to the state, it's disappointing to see that I guess the education might not come first of the children, that there is some sort of political agenda at play. Now, of course, I'm not naive to imagine that there aren't always going to be political agendas at play here. But I mean, I have some congregants who are worried. I mean, should they, where the curriculum is now, I just heard last week, the original authors have now disavowed it. They've washed their hands of it. So,
This tells you what you need to know right there. They feel so strongly that this curriculum doesn't represent the way that they wanted the curriculum to look that they took their names off.
What
the radical
was the reason for doing that? What was their reason for saying, I mean, I mean, we had lobbied, the Jewish community had lobbied, saying don't erase us from history. So they, and don't, have what we consider to be anti-Semitic tropes in this curriculum going to our high school kids. And we amended, and these people who built the curriculum walk out. So explain how that happens.
Well, it's not just us. There were many other ethnic groups that also said you need to represent us as well. The lesson, I think the third draft now has, I want to say something over 20 lesson plans on Asian Americans. It's the largest section now. So there were a few main issues that they had. One was that BDS and the Palestinian cause was no longer included. They said this explicitly. There's a group called Save Arab American Studies, and their explicit goal was the Palestinian story and Palestine must be included in the curriculum. They want to center Palestine in the Arab American section. There's not agreement across Arab American groups for that, but it's become kind of this political wedge issue for a lot of the groups that wanted to retain the original version of the draft curriculum.
Okay, so let me. Go right ahead.
So the other piece of it was a lot of the language did change around the foundational principles and other things, which guided the draft. The foundational principles was based on college level ethnic studies. This needed to be adapted for a mandatory high school, typically 9th grade course. It couldn't be the same. Public school mandate is very different from college mandate, and so that's another thing that they objected to. They wanted, their original thing. Listen, the original draft also had so many pedagogical problems with it. It was not teacher friendly at all. It would have been really hard to implement it. It had things that were really problematic, like they had a privilege walk that required kids to identify if they had ever been sexually harassed. I mean, can you imagine the trauma that could have caused some kids, especially kids that have been sexually abused. And so there were a lot of flaws in the curriculum like that. And, you know, I think the original authors, listen, they took a lot of pride and a lot of ownership stake in the original draft, and now don't feel like it represents their values. I mean, that's their right. Certainly, we disagree. We think this is a much more solid curriculum. We think the third draft, while it's not perfect, we're still, ICS submitted a review with recommending some additional changes, like to some of the historical figures that are problematic. But by and large, like, this third draft is not bad. And if this was the one that was adopted, I think we should, you know, we should feel okay with it. Especially knowing that the same group of folks that removed their names, many of them are a part of a group called Liberated Ethnic Studies. They've written their own curriculum, closer and probably worse than the first draft, and they're now shopping it around to districts, offering free training and free materials to teachers. And so we really need a state-backed, good, solid third curriculum to be able to promote. And we really hope that when the SBC, right now it's in the hands of the SBE, the State Board of Education, the public comment period is closed. The CDE will take a look at all those recommendations, put them together, release this all to the State Board of Education. They'll consider it and they'll either pass it, change it, or not pass it. You know, we think they're not going to make big changes. We think they'll tweak it and pass it pretty close to what's written. That's our best bet. And our best bet, we don't have a position yet, but we will probably be looking at if it stays and the issues are able to be addressed, at trying to support this. And I think it'll be a really important tool for districts to not fall into the trap of this group that's trying to shop the original curriculum and do a runaround.
Wow. Yeah, Ben, I see Ben has a question.
Hey, yeah, Karen, thanks so much for being with us today.
Sure.
So can you speak a little bit to what is in the curriculum now? I mean, I read the model curriculum, or as much as I could handle. It's like, 900 pages or something.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, I think it is complicated, right? I mean, number one, because, Jews are not part of sort of the classical ethnic studies
Right.
sort of rubric, right, at the university level, which is where it comes from.
Right.
And also, we're not an ethnicity, right? We are a whole bunch of ethnicities. So that kind of complicates matters. And I mean, I thought that the piece of the curriculum focusing on Jews, which is sort of a case study of Mizrahi Jewish immigration,
Mm-hmm.
I thought was actually really nuanced and interesting and educational. So can you talk a little bit about like how that piece came to be and sort
Sure.
of who and the people were behind that? Because I mean, clearly it's come a long way from where the curriculum was in the earlier drafts.
Sure. So the third draft, it took out all the second draft took out all the negative language about Jews, references to BDS, all that kind of stuff, and added in mention of anti-Semitism. But the third draft really was the game changer. Not only was the bad stuff still out, but they added in 2 definitions of anti-Semitism through the 2 different Jewish lesson plans, and they had 2 lessons on Jewish Americans. So the one that you mentioned was Jemena Jews indigenous to the Middle East and North Africa. And that centers on anti-Semitism experienced by Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. And the other lesson plan really talks about the intersectional identities of Jews and really helps to underscore the diversity of the Jewish community. Both lesson plans focus on Jews of color because that's what this curriculum is about. It's about primarily people of color, underrepresented communities telling their own stories. And so that's why those particular lesson plans were put in there, not general lessons about Jewish Americans and Jewish American history, because that wouldn't have according to the CDE, wouldn't have fit into the curriculum. And we felt that it was best to get in lesson plans that would fit in with the other, kind of the other models that were in there. All the lesson plans now are put at the end in an appendix. This is what some of the controversy was about, particularly coming from the Arab American community. But there's lots of lessons now. I mean, there's a ton of lesson plans. It might be a little overkill, but many different ethnic groups have themselves represented. Sikh Americans have a lesson plan now. Many different Pacific Islander groups, Korean Americans, others that really didn't feel they were represented in the curriculum. Again, some of the guidance from the state said that, listen, the curriculum, districts should adapt curriculum to meet the needs of their student populations. And so if a student population has a heavy presence of a particular ethnic group, it makes sense that they're going to focus a lot of their time on teaching to that ethnic group. There's no way they're going to cover all of them. It's a one semester course. You can't do justice. The Jewish lesson plans are designed to be, I know the one from ICS is designed for like one day. And I think the Jimena one is maybe 2-day lesson plan, something like that. So they were designed to be really short so that teachers could potentially fit them in.
Thank you, Karen. Yeah, there's some more questions here, so I'm going to do my best to moderate amongst the questions. And it's good to hear that the curriculum has come a long way. It's fascinating just to hear the work of the JCRC through your words, which is just an acknowledgement of where we live, acknowledgement of our culture, the acknowledgement of just society at large, and working within that system, because I think Ben points out a fundamental, I guess, error in structure in terms of how Jews don't really fit into the curriculum as it has been articulated, just because we don't fit into that box, or no one knows which box we fit into, and that's part of our beauty. But you're arguing, look, we still have to work with it. Let's work within it to share our stories, as opposed to just saying this is should not be anything that we should be a part of, or just villainize it. Mark, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, hi, Karen. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this. My question was, when I was a student at UCLA and I graduated about 10 years ago, I became intimately familiar with the use of social justice language to basically say negative things about Israel, whether it was divestment, whether it was anything else. And these things, led to anti-Semitism for students on campus. So I guess my question is, given that the very first draft contained so much of this language, do we know how the people who were drafting it were able to get into such high up positions that they were able to create what could be an institutional change to a state of 40 million people, and that would affect our children, so that if we did not raise our arms and say, hey, this isn't okay, it would have passed, and the children would have had to go through this themselves?
Yeah, it's a good question. We don't know. The state wasn't, one of our big criticisms was that the state wasn't entirely transparent on this process. And they've improved their transparency, much due to the public outcry and uproar. But we have no idea how these folks were appointed. I guess from the state's perspective, they said, let's bring, we're teaching ethnic studies, so let's bring in ethnic studies experts. And maybe people recommended their friends. We don't really know. The state did acknowledge, as I mentioned earlier, that there was a flaw in their process, and they need to make sure in the future that committees like this are more balanced with perspective. They didn't do their homework on this.
Yeah, I guess as a Jewish community, figuring out what can we do, certainly we can say that this curriculum isn't kosher and we can fight the curriculum, but is there something we can do more at a grassroots level to begin to shift the conversation, if the conversation about ethnic studies is going to end with the marginalization of our people? And do you have any ideas about what we can do to become, I guess, more involved in that? I'd be interested to know.
Sure. So yeah, this is something we're really focusing on, because at the end of March, after a curriculum is likely passed, it's not the end of the story. It's really the beginning of the story, because now it goes to the local level. And as we see, districts across the state are in vastly different places in terms of where they are with the curriculum. Curriculum varies from district, those that have it, it varies from district to district. And so it's really important that we become involved. And, you know, it's not just around this issue. We're seeing an increase in anti-Semitism across the board. We're definitely concerned about a lot of the BDS activism going younger. There's even SJP, Students for Justice in Palestine. There's at least two that we've heard of, two clubs being formed in schools, in public high schools. And so this issue, and we see sometimes the Israeli-Palestinian conflict playing out in the classroom. It's sometimes taught in 10th grade. And so, you know, there's multiple reasons for us to be involved. So toward that, we're going to be putting together a holistic and comprehensive community relations plan to address the local implementation district by district. You know, we need to do the core community relations things that we know work, that we know building relationships has helped and led to many of the successes that we saw with making changes to the model curriculum. And we also know that, you know, you can have the best curriculum in the world, but it's up to the teacher in the classroom how they present it. And that being said, I firmly believe that most teachers just want to do a good job. They care about their students. They want all students to feel comfortable, to feel welcome, to feel represented in their classroom. So there's some activist teachers that, you know, have a strong political perspective, want to bring that into their classroom. That is not the majority of teachers. So having that good, solid curriculum is really important. There's also like dozens of school districts in the Bay Area, so we really need a grassroots approach to this. We need to build relationships with decision makers in each one of these districts. We need to mobilize the grassroots. We need parents. We need Jewish teachers. You know, we need other folks that are willing to, you know, kind of roll up their sleeves and get involved on appointed committees, educational foundations, get active in a union, build relationships with school board members. You know, it's kind of an all hands on deck situation. So, you know, that's what we're really thinking about in the coming months as this continues to happen. And that'll allow us not only to address the ethnic studies issue, hopefully to offer good training, hopefully to get the Jewish lesson plans actually taught in the classroom. It'll also allow us to address issues like anti-Semitism that are.
I really am drawn to your moderate approach because I really, that I feel is missing, and going to the extreme levels just seems to be the total detriment of our kids. I mean, that's the only thing that the end result is going to be. I see I have two more hands, but they're both male hands, and I've already called on two men. Are there any women here who have any questions? I just want to make space for the women to ask questions. If not, Alana, go right ahead.
Thank you again, Karen. I'm curious about the idea of allyship and how this fits into this curriculum, because I guess my concern is, you know, is there this idea that the Jews are not allies of the other groups who are being taught in ethnic studies? I'm just not sure how that comes into play and how we can make sure that we're still in allyship. That's my question.
Yeah. I mean, I think approaching this with a level head is really important for allyship. You know, I mean, it's complicated, but if we want other ethnic groups to recognize our struggles, to understand anti-Semitism, to learn about like the anti-Semitic dog whistles, for example, and really get to know them, we have to be an ally to those groups as well. And we have to understand their historic struggle to get their stories told in the classroom. And so, you know, I think it's complicated, but I think that supporting teaching of ethnic studies, supporting a high quality, good curriculum will go a long way toward that.
Stephen.
Yes.
I just want to say Stephen is our Congregation Beth Shalom. I should have mentioned this at the top. Stephen Miller is our JCRC rep from our congregation. And thank you to Stephen because he helped facilitate this conversation with Karen.
Uh, Thank you, Karen, again for agreeing to speak to
My
us.
pleasure.
Yes. I wanted to touch on something you mentioned before about this other group going out and shopping an alternative curriculum. And I wanted to find out how much freedom do these various school districts have in picking the curriculum they want to use, because I could see that be very uh, a big issue when you consider the number of school districts we have in our state. If you could talk about that.
Sure, yeah, it's a big issue and it's a concern. School districts have very wide latitude. They won't be required to use the state curriculum. They'll be required, however, there is the law that talks about, what needs to be in the curriculum. There's the ed code. They have to follow the ed code, and there's a lot of really strong guardrails for what can be taught and what can't be taught in the classroom. We know, of course, not all teachers follow that, and not all districts follow it, but there's a lot of latitude, and that's why building these relationships in every district is going to be so critical.
It's like
There's no great, they absolutely will. A lot of these folks, they come with, these are credentialed professors and others that have a lot of experience teaching ethnic studies at the college level and some at the high school level as well. And so this is going to be, this is going to be tough. But I think we have, I think it's a strong argument to a lot of districts that this group is trying to go around a state process and circumvent it, and trying to basically to delegitimize the California Department of Education, because that's essentially what they're trying to do. And so I think by doing that, by exposing some of the flaws in the curriculum and how harmful it would be to students, including Jewish students, I think that's where our best bet will lie. But again, long term, it's all about relationships with these districts.
Wow, that's it's a stark image of us having to politic, or one curriculum over another. Raf.
Okay, thank you. And thanks again, Karen, for the opportunity to engage and learn. I listened to Yehuda Kurtz's podcast with Ty this morning, and just so glad I did, and so glad that we have this opportunity to learn on an issue that's seriously complex, and I probably misunderstood until today. So I wanted to use the opportunity to kind of do a little bit of inside Bay Area baseball, given the JCRC's consensus-driven model. To the extent you're comfortable and want to, I'd be really interested to hear what the coalition building has looked like locally, regionally. Where have you been pleasantly surprised at finding allies? Where have you been less pleasantly surprised? A little bit to that point about stakeholders and what we can do, but I'm also just really curious about what the portrait and the ecosystem looks like here. Because one thing that Rabbi Ain opened with and that came up in the podcast is how different the Bay Area landscape is to, let's say, New York.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So in terms of forming coalitions, there have been some groups. So we worked, first of all, we worked in coalition when we did all this work broadly with the Jewish Public Affairs Committee and all of the member organizations working on that. And so we put together groups and these were all Jewish organizations to advocate. They submitted ICS's edits to the curriculum and have really supported the effort. We've had dozens of dialogues with decision makers at the CDE, the SBE, and this has been all done in coalition with other organizations. A couple of the partners in that themselves built their own coalition. So for example, AJC built coalitions, I think, with Korean Americans and Sikh Americans and other groups who were similarly concerned that they were left out of the curriculum. We know that there's some other, there's other ethnic groups that have strong perspectives on this as well. And so there's definitely some opportunity, especially as we get down to the local district. Every district has very different politics, as we know. And so where there's opportunity to build these coalitions is will depend. There will be some, I think, statewide opportunity as this moves forward with certain groups that want to make sure that their lesson is also taught in the classroom. But I think it's just going to vary. I know I keep saying it's a district by district grassroots relationship building thing, but it really is.
Awesome, thank you. Can I follow up with just a synagogue specific
Sure.
flavor? Like, what is the nature of the conversation? And like, just if you like want to, again, inside baseball, share some stuff of what have been the hardest conversations with synagogues around like lending their voice to this fight. Where is there either miseducation or friction or convergence or divergence? Like, because this is who we are. We're trying to have this conversation, and I think we lend our support to the initiative. But I imagine like everything in the Bay Area, the state, like that can't be universally true.
Sure. Yeah, so, well, I'd say we got pretty universal interest from congregations. I mean, people were really concerned about this. But you're going to have differences. You're going to have, just like on any issue, you have differences of opinion. And different groups look at this issue from different ways. Some have really focused on the political flaws within the curriculum, focus on the critical race theory kind of thing. And others are more focused, as JCRC is, on representation of Jews, Judaism in Israel, making sure there's no anti-Semitism, making sure that Jewish Americans are in the curriculum. And I think that that's where you've seen a lot of the split in terms of ways what the fundamental issues are and what the ways are to approach it. That said, we still have some common goals. We still want to see. We still want to see a high quality, good curriculum. We don't want to have anti-Semitism, BDS in there, et cetera. But there is a diversion, and that's normal. You're going to have that on every issue.
Thanks, Karen.
Karen, I got a note anonymously, and I hear this, a number of times. We've got a lot of problems here. We're in the middle of a pandemic. California educational system, perhaps not the greatest to begin with. Why are we focused on ethnic studies and larger to renaming schools? How does that happen? Can you share maybe a little bit about that?
Sure. As a public school parent, I always have concerns on the focus of what the Board of Educations are up to sometimes. And in San Francisco, we really felt there were so many flaws with the process around renaming the schools. Not only how they went about doing it, but the fact that we're in the middle of closure with no plan on the table for reopening, and this was the issue they were considering. And so, it was greatly concerning to a lot of folks. I will say the pandemic in particular has laid bare the issues around equity in our community. And in many ways, this has made the mandate for something like ethnic studies even more important. Ethnic studies isn't going to cure the problems, but I think a lot of school boards, seeing what's happening, seeing the pressures on particularly minority communities under COVID and the huge gap. Imagine, look at all the kids now that have been out of school for so long, probably not getting the support that they need despite the best effort of teachers. Compared to kids going to private schools that are back in person, business as usual, getting individualized attention. That's showing there is a huge gap in equity and allocation of resources around education for our students. And so I think that issue coming to the forefront, is something that is making districts feel, at least it's something to start to address some of these issues that our communities are facing.
Yeah. So the next step is March 17th is the vote. Is that right? And it's going to pass?
Yeah, I think it's March 17th. Yeah.
It's going to pass the third draft?
We think that it'll pass. We don't know. I don't have a crystal ball. We think there won't be huge substantive changes. We think it'll pass fairly close to the third draft, hopefully addressing some of the issues that we see.
and we can live with that.
And then it goes, by the way, we'll see the recommendations about 5 days maybe or something like that before it actually goes for a vote. So there's going to be a really short window. So you may hear from us when this comes out. If we see any major problems, we may need to do a quick action alert to get additional comments into the State Board of Education.
Yeah, and maybe the hardest question I have is, what do you say to those people who say that we should not enter into this realm at all? Like this is just awful. This is antithetical to Jewish belief system and the idea of defining people by the critical race theory, and any sort of tacit support from the Jewish community is abhorrent. I mean, how do you address those voices?
I mean, we would just say we disagree, you know, and if we want other people to address our concerns, we need to address their concerns. You know, this is a great opportunity for the Jewish community to get our stories heard, the diversity of our community. You know, it's a multi-ethnic community, it's a multiracial community, it's a multi-denominational community, right? So we have the chance to tell our story from our perspective. And we think that that's something we should be embracing.
And that's very much according to the values of Judaism, certainly the values of our community. We're currently working with B'chol Lashon towards diversity, equity, and inclusion in our shul. We believe that the diversity of our shul is one of its greatest gifts. And I don't mean just diversity of opinion, but I mean diversity in ethnicities and in races and in identities. That's the richness of Jewish life. I get nervous, and my community knows that I get nervous once I see that there's a political squabble afoot, because I see people are going to get stabbed in a political fight. And I guess that fight's going to be necessary to the extent that anti-Semitism is real. I think we're going to have to stand out in front of it, even if we get hurt a little bit. And I guess it's hard for me to ascertain the reality of the dynamic, is what I guess I'm trying to say.
It's complicated.
Is this a small group of people who are trying to impose a perspective on the state? Or is this illustrative of some deep-seated anti-Semitism that sits at the heart of California?
You mean the curriculum?
I mean, who is this state anti-Semitic?
Listen, I think it's a small group of people that had an undue influence on this curriculum. College ethnic studies, the way it is in many universities, is deeply problematic. I mean, there is an Israel issue, and by some extension, a Jewish issue as well. Nobody's going to deny that. And you had a group of folks, and we know who some of these people are. One of the people in particular, we had a number of run-ins, around curriculum at the high school level in the past. So this wasn't like, the way this turned out wasn't a huge surprise. That being said, I don't think the State Department of Education, this shouldn't be reflective of an anti-Semitism problem within the state. I think the way this came about was very complicated, but we need to be vigilant, and we need to be on top of this. We shouldn't for a moment allow any anti-Semitism to come into play in this, regardless of where we stand on critical race theory, any of these other issues. Now we agree on.
I think that's really the point. I mean, that's really the point of what we can do. Stephen, I'm going to cut it to you for the last question, and then I want to thank Karen.
Just touching on what you were talking about, I think we can't forget the fact that we're talking about teenagers who are all of a sudden trying to figure out who they are and trying to understand the world and to give what could be thought of as a college level course where they analytically investigate things, I think is to me, it really could be very detrimental. I think the main thing always when you're talking about kids is to just get them to appreciate and respect other people that are different than them. If we can do that with this course, then I think it accomplishes what it should accomplish. And wait until they get into college to get into more difficult studies.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you for arranging this. I think that, it's a beautiful thing that my 9-year-old daughter sees a school named after a Jewish woman who became a senator here in California. And so to the extent that our children can see their identities reflected in the curriculum that they are taught, the more empowered they will be to have a positive impact on our world. And the more we marginalize them, I worry about what comes after that. So I thank you, Stephen, for organizing this. Karen, thank you. This was not easy. This is a hard group and a really
some great questions.
Really challenging conversation. And I just want to thank you. I didn't, I wasn't sure how the conversation was going to go, but I knew we had to have it as a community. And I just really admired your approach, how you are handling this issue, how your thoughtfulness and what the JCRC is doing from a real pragmatic perspective, not from a utopian worldview, but from a real pragmatic, how do we maintain our interests and make sure that the Jews are safe. So kol hakavod to you. Thank you for your time. And I'm going to shut the camera. I'm going to shut the recording off now. And if anybody wants to stay, you can do that as well. So thank you again.